All right, the Wall Street Journal editorial board is out with a new piece entitled Matt Gaetz is a bad choice for Attorney General. It reads in part this: Mr. Trump lauded Mr. Gaetz' law degree from William & Mary, but it might as well be a doctorate in outrage theater. He's a performer, he's a provocateur, and his views is that the more explosions he can cause, the more attention he can get. Mr. Gaetz has no interest in governing. When Republicans took control of the House in 2022, it was with a smaller margin. Rather than work to get things done, Mr. Gaetz sabotaged Speaker Kevin McCarthy before finally leading a rebellion to oust him. The U.S. Attorney General has to make calls on countless difficult questions of whom to investigate and indict. Mr. Gaetz' decisions simply wouldn't be trusted. He's a nominee for those who want the law used for political revenge, and it won't end well. Former federal and state prosecutor Eli Honig writes, Trump's nomination of Matt Gaetz is a sign of dark intentions. Quote, the impending nomination of Gaetz as the nation's top law enforcement official is about as dark and clear as harbingers can get. Gaetz prides himself on political attack dog tactics, on unquestioningly defending Trump, and on settling scores or perceived scores against his political opponents. And there will be precious few guardrails in place to check his power. Republican majorities will run the Senate and probably the House, so don't expect meaningful congressional oversight. There's little the judiciary can do to rein in an investigation either, though the courts play a larger role, and hopefully, if and hopefully not when, any of this turns into politically driven indictments.
And he goes on to say that Bill Barr even had a line he wouldn't cross. While Barr uses power unabashedly to defend Trump, he generally would not use the department as an offensive weapon. And Willie, that's obviously the concern that you're hearing from Republicans. And this is what's, again, kind of goes back to the Tulsi Gabbard pick, which at the end of the day, really bad, most Republicans believe, and Democrats, for the intel community, therefore bad for the United States of America, but ultimately bad for the president of the United States, who needs to get the best intel that he or she can get from around the world. And that certainly would be the case with President Trump. And we just talked about Soleimani as an example of a time when he got the best intel he could get and did something that others couldn't. But you have Republicans also, and the Wall Street Journal editorial page. You have others asking the same thing about Matt Gaetz, just saying this is not good for the Justice Department, not good for the Republican Party, not good. At the end of the day, though, again, not good for President Trump. So these are picks that I don't think would strengthen his cabinet, would strengthen his White House, but actually weaken it, because he would have people at jobs where they have absolutely no idea how to handle the bureaucracy they're working for.
So, Claire McCaskill, with that in mind, do you believe that your former colleagues in the United States Senate, despite the fealty they've shown almost to a man and a woman to Donald Trump on everything here in the last couple of years, and especially now that they believe he's come into Washington with a mandate, do you believe, at least in the case of Matt Gaetz and perhaps in the case of Tulsi Gabbard, that they will vote this down? And I'm curious about your concern. What do you think it's legitimate about this idea of recess appointments?
Well, first, let's put this in context. Yesterday morning, the United States Senate gave the back of their hand to Donald Trump. Everybody in the Senate knew that Donald Trump did not want John Thune as leader. Now, why were they able to do that? Because it was a secret ballot. But nonetheless, they did it. Then a couple of hours later, he drops Gaetz and Gabbard. Now, I made a list last night of 11 names of senators that I think are most likely to say no to both of these appointments, particularly Gaetz. And keep in mind a few of these names, like Chuck Grassley, for example. Grassley's not going to run again. He just got reelected, and he's 90. You've got Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell's not going to run again. You've got Susan Collins, who I can't imagine voting for these people. You've got Lisa Murkowski. I can't imagine Lisa voting for these people. You only need 3. So I think Trump was sending a letter to the Senate saying one of two things. Either I expect the Senate to ignore the part of the Constitution which says you must give advice and consent, or two, you've got to show me that you have no power. I need you to demonstrate to me that the Senate is not in session ever, because what you do does not matter. I just don't think either one of those are going to sit well with the majority of the United States Senate. And and keep in mind, Willie, they still have to do a background check on Matt Gaetz. Anybody who thinks the FBI can't get what the Ethics Committee has in the House has never been subjected to a background check. And trust me, a background check for Attorney General is not your average run-of-the-mill background check. And the same thing for Tulsi Gabbard. The background check for DNI is not your average background check. So, and I just don't think this recess appointment thing is going to fly with the Supreme Court for jobs like Attorney General of the United States.
Yeah, there was certainly deep skepticism on Capitol Hill that either A, Gaetz could get the votes, or B, that the recess appointment plan would go through. But as many sources did caution, you can never say never in the Trump era, as unlikely as it is. So, Andrew Weissmann, let's talk about this selection. First, you certainly know the Department of Justice intimately. Give us your sense of the reaction you believe is happening inside that building to the possibility of Matt Gaetz leading it as Attorney General, and also what it would be like if Gaetz, if he does find a path to confirmation, if he does find his way into that post. Just what would that look like for the Department of Justice and the nation?
Well, I think the reaction in the department is really one of shock, and it's not because of a policy difference. People at the department have been there for years and years, and they are used to the fact that elections have consequences and that you can have attorney generals and you can have presidents who come in with very different agendas. But the reason for the shock is not that. It's that just start with the fundamental. There's a complete lack of qualification for the job. In other words, you might disagree with Bill Barr, you might disagree with Sessions or Merrick Garland, but they're serious people. They're people who are able to do the job. And people can disagree with how they did it and whether they adhered to all of the norms. But with Matt Gaetz, I think the biggest concern, leaving aside his sort of MAGA fealty, leaving aside his own potential criminal problem, is he simply doesn't have the chops for a job that is intended to protect all of us. And that's really, I think, the biggest issue I think people at the department would have, is the idea that this is a job which you are tasked with protecting the public day in and day out, not just from ordinary crimes, but from terrorist crimes. And that's why the idea of Matt Gaetz or Tulsi Gabbard being in these positions, I think, would be so anathema to people who have taken an oath to the Constitution to protect the United States, and the concern that they just don't have the experience to do these jobs. Obviously, if they were to be in the position, people will do what they're required to do legally, but these people also have taken an oath to the Constitution, and they're not going to do something that is illegal, either against the law or where the facts simply do not support it. So I suspect you will have that kind of resistance. You will also, I think, see what you saw during the first Trump administration, which is people resigning, which is just does not happen except in the most extraordinary circumstances, which is something that we saw during the first Trump presidency. And this signals that we would see it again.
Yeah. Caddy, when Andrew talks about the lack of experience of Matt Gaetz or Tulsi Gabbard to hold these positions, it really does underline what I've been saying this morning, that actually we can talk about the disservice it does for everybody, but especially to Donald Trump. I remember reading Bob Gates, one of Bob Gates' biographies. Now, nobody knew how to work Washington better than Bob Gates. But the secretary and the director, CIA, would write that it was a constant battle, staying one step ahead of the bureaucrats that were around him, people that were trying to help him, but that it was a constant grind and a constant, to be able to move an agency in the direction that the president wants the agency to move in. You need people that are really, really experienced hands, or else they'll just get swallowed up in these bureaucracies. I don't care what, some think tank says about being able to fire all the members of the, quote, deep state. It's just, that's not going to happen in a way that's going to make these jobs any less difficult. So it seems to me, again, what's in the best interest of the president is to find people that have experience, that line up with him ideologically, and that can actually do the job. And these two candidates, Republicans in the House, Republicans in the Senate, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, people that have worked with both of these people will tell the president, to a man and a woman, they are not qualified, Mr. President. They will not be doing you any favors.
So I would put Pete Hegseth in that bracket too. I mean, I've had conservative Republicans reach out to me saying, listen, they think he is a terrific guy, but he's just, the pick is, as one would describe it, unfathomable, because he just has no experience running something on the magnitude of the Department of Defense. And Matt Gaetz and Tulsi Gabbard are in that category as well. So I think you're right. And the through line that we're hearing this morning is this issue of competence and whether even Donald Trump will be able to get his agenda accomplished if he puts people in positions who just aren't up to the job or have the experience to do the job. I guess the countervailing view from Donald Trump's point of view is that populists are elected around the world on the basis that they are not normal establishment political types. I mean, they're elected in a way because they don't have traditional political experience. But for Donald Trump, when he did in his first administration put people in positions of power who didn't have that experience, it didn't work out particularly well for him. So he still wants the disruptors who will come in, blow up the intelligence community, question whether the Department of Defense really needs all the people it has, is spending, question, as Elon Musk has been put in, to kind of, slash spending by $2 trillion or whatever it is. But actually, the system doesn't really allow for that type of person to flourish. So, Greg, I mean, how do you think this plays into the idea of competence, and does this actually work in the way that even Donald Trump might want it to work?
Well, it evinces, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding or lack of understanding on the part of the president-elect, even after having served as president for 4 years, about how the government really works and how these agencies and departments work. But let me go back, if I could, just for a moment to the comment that Senator McCaskill made about the background investigation. In the normal course, of course, traditionally, presidents, White Houses have used the FBI to do background investigations to be able to, generally before a nomination is announced, but not always, to gauge whether or not the person really was qualified and could pass a background investigation and get the requisite security clearance to do the job and be confirmed and do the job. But let's remember that as important as that has been to the process, the president doesn't have to have a background investigation done. If the president wants to, excuse me, simply say, we're not going to use the FBI, or we're not going to do a background investigation at all, a background investigation will not be done. And in fact, the president can decide who gets a security clearance without regard to a background investigation at all. Now, the Senate, as Senator McCaskill knows well, will have something to say about that if the White House decides to go in a different direction. But we have seen signals already that the White House, the transition team, is talking about doing away with background investigations in the normal course. That will be a big deal.